We are now taking over the airwaves. This is Ultimate You Radio. We are here to create extraordinary change through mindset, nutrition, and training. Life is way too short not to be the ultimate version of you.
All right, everybody, welcome to UI Radio. We have an epic episode for you today. I'm really excited about this one, and I've really been looking forward to it, to be honest. We are sitting here with Dr. Corey Schuler. How are you doing, my friend?
Doing great.
Excellent. Let me give you a bit of a hype up because I think you deserve it. So Dr. Schuler is an internationally recognized expert in the field of functional medicine and metabolism, and you're frequently sought after expert pretty much on all things health. I've heard so many of your interviews, and every one of them's captivated me for sure, and I love the work that you do. You're a certified nutrition specialist practitioner, licensed nutritionist, a chiropractic physician, and you've also earned degrees in nursing and phytotherapeutics. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Pretty wise man we have right here, community. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Schuler. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome.
Awesome, mate. So look, let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you got into this space.
Well, I've been interested in health. A lot of people get in through athletics or an injury or something like that. I actually got into it or interested because of a really significant incident that happened to me when I was working as a chemist. It was a dopey thing on my part, but the reality was it sort of all came together. I was working at NASA. We were trying to build materials to shoot into space to make satellites lighter. And I was like really engaged and really interested in it. And then I ended up spilling like some toxic organic solvents on myself and my supervisor's supervisor. So like the boss lady. And number one, it had me reevaluate if I should be a competent chemist. But number two, it kind of made me reevaluate, like, was that my passion? Is that what I was interested in? Clearly ended up not being, because I don't work there anymore. But what was interesting is it kind of led me down this path of more like holistic type medicine, primarily because I had a medical physician as a mentor. He was a breast cancer oncologist, still is. And I told him, I said, I think I want to go into health. I think I want to go to medical school. And he said, medical school is fine for some people, but your brain's like sort of wired a little bit differently. So you should try something sort of on the periphery. And so that's sort of what I did and zoomed in on this.
Wow. It's amazing. So you've had quite a diverse range of experience in many fields. What do you love about what you do right now?
I love it when I get the call from a patient and says, it worked. And I've tried so many different things and I have so many different hurdles in my life, and this changed for me. And with kind of chronic disease and stuff like this, it's not like, oh, I had this disease and now I don't. Sometimes we get that, right? That's a home run, and those are really cool and super special. But sometimes the really interesting ones are I couldn't go up a flight of stairs and now I ran a 5K. I still have the disease, I still have the problems, I still have to manage it and watch it, but man, I can do so much more than I ever could before. So that's the stuff that gets me up in the morning and keeps me up at night, I guess.
Yeah, I love it. So look, I'm really fascinated with how nutrition affects mood, anxiety, depression, really just how it affects peak performance in general. I'd love to get your take on it. And you've had a lot of experience in there, but how really important is nutrition with mood, anxiety, depression?
I think one of my colleagues has said this sort of offhandedly, that sometimes we are a little bit willy-nilly about health. It's just an SRI, I've heard, or it's just a name brand, antidepressant or anxiolytic, and they said these are really powerful medications, and they affect an organ that we don't know a ton about. We're learning more about the brain and how it works, but we don't really know, and it's not as predictable as the liver or kidneys or even the heart. The brain, man, it's weird. And so if you're not willing to optimize everything else, we probably shouldn't go to those medications quite yet. There's always a place for those. Clearly, they're important in management of some of these mental health diseases. But if we're jumping in and sort of not thinking about them as seriously as we once did, then we're making an error. And nutrition really does fill in a lot of those blanks.
Yeah, absolutely. What sort of foods have you found, I guess, negatively impact people's moods, anxiety, states in general?
Yeah, I'm actually, I've been teaching a course on ketogenic diet, and ketogenic diet's super powerful. It has a lot of good neurologic benefits, and I sort of lean towards the ketogenic community. But it's well known that can have some short-term and some, longer term negative effects on mental health too. Some people get really depressed, just don't handle that well. And then on the opposite, so a high-fat diet sometimes is detrimental, but it depends on the individual. I've also found that just minimizing carbohydrates, not quite to that ketogenic level, for some people is just it just tips them off. With that said, sometimes the carb loading freaks among us, the ones that love our breads and pastas and all sorts of things, have sort of the more of those problems. So I sort of led with ketogenic stuff, but I find that, obviously gluten sensitivity or celiac disease is a significant neurologic problem. I actually wrote a paper one time on how dairy is a potential risk factor for schizophrenia. And we have all of these mounting pieces of evidence that these allergenic type proteins sort of cause the brain to be on proverbial fire. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So would you say that with nutrition and movement that we can almost like beat anxiety, depression? Do you think they have that, bigger impact on the situation in general?
Yeah, in many ways, yes, that's entirely possible. And maybe stated another way, a good mental health management or even just cognitive performance. Think about somebody who just wants to be better, smarter, do more. It can't miss nutrition and it can't miss movement. I think that's a better way to say it. Sometimes you can't totally get at some of these deeper mental health problems with just diet and lifestyle, but you definitely can't get there if you don't address it.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the other factors that you've found have negatively affected people's moods and states in your experience?
Yeah, I like to screen for some of these just I'll call them boring micronutrients because they don't get a lot of press. But I look for vitamin D deficiency, vitamin D even insufficiency. I like vitamin D levels a lot higher than what would be necessary to fend off poor bone health. So I want high vitamin D levels. Typically, I'd like sufficient levels of zinc, and zinc is sort of a hard analyte to measure. Serum zinc's not very good, red blood cell zinc. Anyway, getting into the weeds a little bit on this, but zinc is one of those micronutrients that isn't found in a lot of different foods. If you were to go to your favorite search engine and say, foods high in zinc, you'd probably find a bunch of foods that you don't usually eat. So that's a big impact on things like social anxiety and people who are, like to avoid crowds. Sometimes they just say, oh, I'm just an introvert. But a lot of times they have sort of this agoraphobia. They just don't want to leave the house. And zinc and then also B6 play a significant role in that. So look for B6, look for zinc, look for vitamin D, and I'd be remiss to not mention things like magnesium. Magnesium acts directly on some major structures of the brain to do that, as well as some of the primary fats that make up the cell membranes and neurons. So things like phosphatidylcholine and phosphatidylserine. I'm looking at EPA and DHA from fish primarily. And those are all like part of my squadron of nutrients. Now we can get sort of into the nitty gritty because I like some botanicals that work really well for that too, that have good evidence, but from a food base, that's kind of what I'm assessing.
That's amazing. So you've linked nutrients and micronutrients to specific behavioral patterns in people.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, we see it and it's fairly predictable.
It's amazing. That is incredible. So I want to go back to your point about dairy. So just quickly, you said that, it can sometimes be a hot topic, but you said that, there's some negative effects potentially linked to psychosis, was it?
Yeah, schizophrenia. So yeah, not necessarily something that somebody wants to be diagnosed with. It's a fairly debilitating condition. Both has sort of positive symptoms that show up, and also they call them negative symptoms. So you see people with schizophrenia oftentimes have like a flat affect. They just don't respond the way you'd expect people to respond to. Individuals with autism sometimes have these behaviors as well. So, but dairy has an inflammatory response that's similar to opioid medication. They break down. So casein is a primary protein in dairy, and casein breaks down into something called a caseomorphin, and that sounds a lot like morphine, right? Because it looks structurally a lot like that as well. So as an opioid effect, it can decrease your respiratory rate, but increase your pulse rate, which is a weird phenomenon. You feel just sort of out of whack because your breathing is slow, but your pulse is racing, and sometimes that feels like your heart is racing. And long-term exposure is very problematic for susceptible individuals. Some people handle it just fine.
Wow, that's incredible. And you've written a paper on this, did you say?
Yeah, I did.
Awesome. So I want to ask you a question about how, I guess, people's unresourceful behaviors are linked to their nutrition. And often when people get anxious or get sad or their moods are altered during the day, week, or any time of the year, they then tend to go into a vicious cycle of eating unresourceful foods, sugars, things that just aren't really going to help them. Can you give us a bit of an idea of why that actually happens? And then potentially we can talk about ways of overcoming it. Yeah,
there's probably a few different theories that explain this well. One of them is simply a neurotransmitter imbalance, things like inefficiencies or insufficiencies of the neurotransmitter dopamine is common in that. And when the body needs something, it doesn't always have like different switches to pull. So it just expresses itself in one way, and that is eat, because we know that some of those basic fundamental building blocks come from food. So you just eat. You have kind of two choices when you need a chemical in your body. You either break it down from your own tissue or you ingest it. And so sometimes it's just you have a craving for something, and your choices don't necessarily meet what those cravings are. So sometimes we're really craving things like chocolate. Like you get that like chocolate craving. Oftentimes that's tied directly to a need for dopamine, but there's not a ton of dopamine and benefits in chocolate, a little bit, but not a ton. So you eat a lot of it to keep, because you're not getting satisfied and you keep going with it. So that's one of those challenges, I would say, that you do get into a bit of a vicious cycle when your body craves something. The best thing to do is to continue to eat a balanced diet. And it almost sounds like boring advice, right? Because now I'm telling you this because you're only going to be able to apply that if you're not already stuck. If you're stuck, you kind of need somebody to whack you on the side of the head and say, stop, we're going to do something different. I'm going to take you out for a good meal and a few. Actually, one of the best ways to get out of the cycle is to make sure, and this is probably not what you think I'm going to say, is probably to make sure you're not deprived of sleep. Oftentimes, sleep deprivation causes our brain chemistry to go awry and allows us to make poor choices. So one of my colleagues has a rule. He says, I want you to stay in bed in the dark, no TV, no alarm clocks, no phones, no whatever, for 12 hours in a row, and then repeat that for 2 more days. So 3 days of 12 hours in total darkness, and then see how you feel. Hard to cram that into a schedule sometimes, but it works pretty well.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think I've personally felt that, when you are tired, when you are run down, your willpower wavers, and I'm sure internally there's a lot going on as well, but you are, I guess, primed to go to those unresourceful foods continuously, which is such a negative cycle. And it's like, it always seems like the more that you obviously eat, the more that you need and want, similar to a drug, cocaine or something like that. Very, very addictive.
Yes.
What sort of foods would you recommend to, I guess, prevent cravings and things of that nature?
So the best way to figure out that is to figure out what your constitution or what your health status really means. We know from a fair amount of evidence that some people do well with a vegan or vegetarian diet. Some people do well on, as I mentioned, ketogenic or a very low carbohydrate diet. Some people do well on a mixed, like paleo, Mediterranean zone style diet. And most of us don't ever take the time to figure out which one we jive with. We do one for 30 days or whatever and say, yeah, I guess I felt better, or I didn't feel better, or whatever. But we don't take a systematic, really sort of a scientific method approach to it. And so, but that should be our go-to. If we knew what was best for us, then that could be our go-to. Same way with fasting state. Some people do better eating, every 3 hours. Some people are best fasting for 18, 19 hours a day. I have ways that we can sort of work through that. Usually in about 3 weeks, I can work with a person one-on-one to figure out their best style of eating, as well as how much they should or shouldn't fast. And that is a little bit of a guess right now. Some people are leaning towards genetic testing, or they're leaning towards blood type testing or other things that get them in that direction. And that's fine. But the reality is when you experienced changes in mood, pain, sleep, and energy on a frequent basis on one type of plan, then you it's right for you, and that should be your go-to. So I didn't answer your question. I did a bad job answering your question, except I answered it the right way, and that is you got to do what's in sort of your corner. What food plan is on your side?
Awesome. So with like brain health, for example, is there a type of diet that you find works better than others?
If I had to pick, I would say most of the time it's a low carbohydrate diet. Sometimes a very low carbohydrate diet, enough to generate nutritional ketosis. And this is kind of where, and it's new, at least in our markets, these exogenous ketone bodies. So things like ketone salts and ketone esters, which I don't use or recommend yet, but there's mounting evidence that says there probably could be use for them. And so we're looking at using those as a dietary supplement in addition to low carbohydrate or a ketogenic type diet in order to transition in. We just know that there's profound effects on the brain with ketones as a fuel source. And we also know that detrimental effects long-term of high insulin levels lead to things like Alzheimer's. I think David Perlmutter is probably famous for referring to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. And I definitely concur with his read of the literature on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a really scary thought when we look at society in general and the amount of sugars that we actually have, week to week, especially, unfortunately, the people that don't know this or don't have the awareness around it, and they think that it's okay. I actually did a great interview with Dr. Perlmutter, and it blew my mind, some of the things that he said. So I think it's a very, very important topic to get out there. It's awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you often stress about the importance of hormonal balance, which of course is crucial to overall health. How do our listeners know if they have hormonal imbalance?
It's a great question. It's a super hard question because hormone imbalances aren't like nutrient deficiencies or toxicities or anything like that. Hormones are like an orchestra, and they sort of have to play all nice together. And so it's easy to take even a good test can be a bad interpretation if it's not taken into context with the other things. So I always kind of defer to DHEA. So DHEA is an androgenic type hormone, and it's common. It's really easy. It's a good test to run for DHEA sulfate or DHEAS. But you can get that. It can be high, and you can worry about hyperandrogenism in women, like women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, or women with acne, or men who have prostate problems, or any of these hyperandrogen issues. But that analyte in and of itself is affected by things like pregnenolone and to some degree progesterone. It changes with cortisol levels, and so they all affect both stress hormones and sex hormones. And to have a hormone imbalance, it could show up as headaches. We have hormone related headaches. We have weight gain. We have women's hair tend to fall out sometimes. That is usually a fast drop in estrogen or estradiol specifically. We could have mood issues like being anxious. The first thing I think of if a woman, especially in her reproductive years, says, I feel a lot of anxiety, and it changes a little bit throughout the month, I'm thinking that's probably progesterone. Progesterone is supposed to be in a huge bolus once a month, and if you're either a poor ovulator, you're not ovulating, or there's other challenges with that. If that's not happening, you don't create this huge bolus of progesterone, and that really is a great calming agent in the body. So that's where we start. But it's sort of like pulling on different threads and of the spider web and figuring out kind of which one is right. I like urine tests. If I can jump to a bottom line here, I like urinary tests for this. It measures the whole cascade of hormones really easily, really inexpensively, and you can do it multiple times a day. You can do it multiple times a month for a cycling woman, for example. So I like urine. I like urine for hormone testing. Probably shouldn't.
We needed that last.
Need to clarify a little bit when I say that.
Yeah, absolutely. But awesome info. So there are things that can, obviously, what are things that trigger hormonal imbalance for the people listening?
Stress is primarily stress and blood sugar dysregulation are the two primary drivers, at least in my experience, for hormone issues. If you talk to somebody else, they might say it's environmental toxicities or things that they run into, but that's not my expertise, and I acknowledge the data, but what I see primarily is insulin gone wild, causing things like inflammation to the ovaries specifically. I see stress causing different production of chemicals like ACTH, which then ends up releasing cortisol from the body. If I could nail it down, if I could just wipe those two off and say those aren't problems anymore, I would get rid of a bunch of hormone-related issues in my office.
Yeah, wow. So obviously stress is a huge one you've just mentioned. Is there, aside from nutrition, which of course, plays a huge part, decreasing stress, meditation, yoga, things of that nature, will that have a huge impact on bringing your hormones back into balance?
Absolutely. The challenge right now in research is, we can't really blind ourselves to knowing if you're doing yoga, so there's no placebo. So the evidence never reaches the highest level. So doctors especially are a little bit hesitant, although it's not going to hurt you, right? Unless you're doing some wacky yoga thing. But meditation and yoga, very, very extremely safe, the safest thing on the planet, and probably can do nothing but help. And so when you look at it that way, then yes, we should all be doing it. But what I can't say is I can't predictably tell any one person how much it's going to help them. And that's hard because sometimes we want to know, we want a prognosis, we want to see how long is it going to take before I get better, how much am I going to get better? And those are questions that we don't really have great answers to. We're filling them in slowly but steadily. But what we know is that perception of the world around you, rumination about past negative thoughts, those all contribute really significantly to poor stress response. And if anything can disrupt that, and yoga and meditation, prayer, those things seem to be leading the approach to it. So yeah, I'm all for it. More the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course with the nutrition, reducing the sugars, oxidized fats plays a huge role in reducing the internal stress on the body.
Absolutely. Yeah. We always think about stress as, waiting in line at the bank, or in traffic, or my boss is mad at me, or those sorts of stresses, those psychological stressors. But your point is well taken. Physiologic or physical stressors are things that we don't necessarily know or pay attention to. And that's where functional medicine, I think, really shines, because oftentimes we point out or pick out or find those things that that tack that you were sitting on that you didn't know you were sitting on.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have, I guess, some core supplements that you love to recommend when trying to reduce stress on the body and bring people's cortisol levels down, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, a lot actually. So I have to be a little bit cautious about it. So I like formulas oftentimes that are made or designed to go together that have 4 or 5 things in them, because here's my long list of ingredients. Number one is there's a German ingredient version of oral lavender that I use for anybody who's anxious. It's called Selexan, and it's in a particular type of soft gel. And anyway, that's what I use for anxiousness. But to bring down cortisol and adapt to stress, magnolia bark seems to be really good. That has an ingredient called hanakayal in it that is like, it can relax and settle somebody's system down, both like phenotypically, they feel and look relaxed, but also it sort of reduces down a lot of output from the neurologic system. So magnolia bark, phosphatidylserine has a lot of good evidence to bring down cortisol. L-theanine has been studied in schizophrenics, and so I use that one a lot. That's a modified amino acid from green tea or found in green tea leaves. And then I like adaptogenic herbs. So ashwagandha sort of has, I think, the best reputation in the room as far as adaptogenic herbs go, Indian herb. So I like that. I like maca or Lepidium peruvianum, especially in cases that also involve hormone-related imbalance. Holy basil seems to be another one. And I mean, the list goes on and on. Eleutherococcus is probably what used to be called Siberian ginseng, but Eleutherococcus sentacoccus is another fantastic herb with pretty good evidence to support how it actually works. So nobody go out and buy all of those individually, because that would be nutty. Oftentimes they're found together, and they're designed to bring down cortisol or help you improve your cortisol secretion throughout the day.
Awesome. So the message in that is there's solutions out there, but see a professional so you can get the specifics on it to obviously start working on what you need to.
Save yourself some time by asking somebody who's done this before.
And some money, by the sounds of it. So you mentioned sleep before, and obviously you talk about this a lot because it's so important. But I mean, let's lay it down. How important is sleep? I know it sounds like a silly question, but how important is it? And is the 7 to 8 hours a night sort of the truth, the go, or is it different?
If I have to answer what I know to be scientifically validated, I would say we have no idea. It seems to be that's a pretty darn good recommendation. I know like Harry Houdini and some other like very successful people, recommend that or say that they only needed 5 hours of sleep. That's probably true for them, but that is an extremely rare situation. And I think a lot of people need a lot more than that. And it's probably more common to need more than 8 hours of sleep to really function. We have an infant in our house right now, and he's sleeping all the time. And I'm just like, man, but he's growing, right? Everything has to work right. Any nutrition that he takes in, it has to go to the right spot and be used the right way. And man, that design's not wrong. That design's, and it doesn't change as we get older. We need less of it, obviously, but sleep is the factor that changes how we utilize and how we adapt to and recover from stress and stressful situations, and basically just life in general. To punctuate this is that people with fibromyalgia, there's a leading theory that goes to the route of this. Fibromyalgia is a condition of lack of sleep. And it might be not an insufficient amount of sleep, but it might be an insufficient quality of sleep. And if you don't sleep deep enough, and you don't get into that reparative and restorative sleep, then all the damage and stuff that's been done to your muscles just by, even sitting around all day never gets repaired. And so if that doesn't happen, now you hurt all the time because there's literally damage sitting around everywhere. So could I emphasize sleep anymore? I don't think so. Like, give me the tallest building on the tallest hill and let me scream about it. Cause I mean, sleep is king.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned Houdini and some of these people that, so they can do 4 or 5 hours continuously. And then of course, most of us need to get that 7 to 8 hours. What's the difference between these people? Are the other guys just superhuman, or what do you think the core differences are?
Either they're lying or they're wired differently. I mean, we know so much about biochemical individuality. Like, I do think that there's people that are potentially wired in a different way, that maybe they repair faster, or, like Wolverine. Wolverine probably doesn't need a lot of sleep. But the reality is that I have no idea how that happens. I don't know how to get into that state, but I do know that modest and chronic sleep deprivation has a myriad of effects that are measurable. We know that it increases inflammation. We know that it increases your risk for things like IBS and IBD, so gut issues. It definitely changes things like even upper gastric issues, so GERD or heartburn. That increases on just an hour of not enough sleep a day for a couple of weeks will make those changes. So you got to be really diligent about taking care of yourself.
Yeah, so true. And I mean, so many times I've seen with clients where they've hit a plateau, they can't seem to lose any more weight, and all of a sudden they go on a vacation, their stress levels drop, they actually get some sleep, and all of a sudden they're losing weight, and it's incredible. Plus feeling absolutely amazing and alert and back to their normal self. So totally. I think that everyone can, everyone's experienced that, I'm sure, and it's so important to pay attention to it, because we often try to ignore it and push the boundaries consistently.
Yeah. I was gonna say the last point of it is sometimes we find it like sleep is a weakness, right? Or it's a proud moment when we say, yeah, I can, I powered through it and I didn't need sleep. Sort of a badge of honor. And I think that's really detrimental to our long-term health status. So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, 100% agree. How do you think the modern lifestyle has affected sleep and circadian rhythm and how we are at the moment in society?
Absolutely. That's a huge question, right? But yeah, our circadian rhythm, we have time restricted sleep all the time just by having alarm clocks and that sort of thing, and even keeping cell phones near our beds and even like Wi-Fi and wiring close to the bed. So there's some hints and tips. Usually people in my world say, drag your bed out so it's not right up against the wall. Like, allow there to be like something between your bed and your wall, just from the copper wires and things that go through there. Turn your Wi-Fi router off at night if you have one at all. Don't keep your cell phone in the room with you. Have an analog, old school travel clock. Those things can benefit you a lot. And then for sure, get the TV out of the bedroom. So
absolutely. What about stimulants during the day and caffeine and things of that nature? What sort of impact have you seen that having on people?
Yeah, well, now you're poking onto some things that are near and dear to my heart, so I got to be a little bit careful.
Unleash the wisdom.
The thing is, coffee has some good evidence to support, brain health, reduction in risk of Alzheimer's, reduction in risk in diabetes, which I mentioned are probably related. And so there's some benefit to it. Is the benefit from all the polyphenols and the cholinergic acid in coffee, or have we figured it out yet or not? We don't know, but we all drink a lot of coffee. A lot of people drink a lot of different coffee, but when it's just black is probably when it has the most benefits to it. When we add the sugars and the creams and the other stuff, now that's not really coffee anymore. But plain black coffee, plain black or green tea, I think has a huge amount of benefit. And this is where I tend to argue a lot with circadian rhythm folks, because I think that coffee should be consumed either before light of day or between like noon and 3, based on some work on what they call Zeitgebers, another German word that means essentially a stimulant to your circadian rhythm. And so most of us are drinking coffee between, light of day or 6 or 7 a.m. and then like noon maybe. And that's been the common recommendation. If you're going to drink coffee, stop drinking coffee before 2 p.m. Well, I say, yeah, but there's a window in there that you shouldn't drink it either. So if you're up before dawn, seems like a good idea. And then around lunchtime, maybe you could have some there too. I drink 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day. So if you're sensitive to it, don't do it. Don't listen to me. But I think there's a place for it, and a pretty cool place actually.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm a big fan of coffee. We're actually from Melbourne, Australia, which is crazy about coffee. Coffee snobs everywhere. But I'm interested in what you just said about having coffee before the sun comes up, and obviously between, you say, noon and 3. What effect does that actually have on the circadian rhythm?
So we're figuring it out. I feel like I have to say that a lot. But the reality is that our retinal tissue in our eye is really sensitive to light patterns, right? And so think about, there's some like video games, I think, that do a good job of this, that you're either up or you're down, and like that's the only motion. They're usually really simple video games. And Zeitgebers are sort of like that. They act on genes like human performance gene 1, 2, and 3. And there's a gene called the clock gene, because we're clever and like to name things that make some sense. Another one called BMAL1, and those are like off and on switches. And so like waking up in the morning, that's a Zeitgeber because it's first light. And so the light hits the retina, and then that's like changes you from a sleepy state, a groggy state, to an awake state. But now another Zeitgeber is caffeine. And caffeine, if you're on the tired side of things, it'll get you up. But if you've already awoken for the day and got yourself moving, caffeine can actually act as a Zeitgeber to change you in a different direction. And so I usually say, before dawn is fine because you're leveraging the Zeitgeber of daylight, and then you leverage the Zeitgeber of your, decreasing energy throughout the day. So I wish I had like a clear picture for you. It's mostly pieced together evidence and a lot of preclinical stuff that leads me to make those sorts of arguments.
Absolutely. It's super fascinating. I want to ask you about the importance of sleeping and then waking up at the same time every day. What's your opinion on that? Do you think we need to wake up at the same time every day? Are there benefits to that?
It's massively important. And so there's research that shows about, looks at HPA axis activation, and that's a easily measured thing to do. And one of the things that affects that most, negatively affects that, is waking up at different times each day. So having a really strict schedule, some people work during the week and then the weekend they sleep in. That might be good to sort of catch up on sleep, but I say there's no such thing as catching up on sleep, and you're probably doing yourself a disservice in a lot of regard by doing that, because it's a major stressor to the body, so a big stimulant to HPA axis, and vice versa. Waking up super early, I need to fly to Frankfurt, I need to get up super early. Not only is the time change going to affect me, but having to get up earlier than I usually do is going to be problematic for me as well. But I know that's going to happen, so I got to kind of prepare and be ready to restore.
Yeah, absolutely. So what, I guess, some of the negative effects that take place on the body if you are getting this disjointed sleep, or if you're traveling around the world and you're going from one time zone to another, is it really detrimental? There's some things that we can also do to counteract that.
Sure. In simplest terms, it has the same effects as elevated cortisol levels. So elevated cortisol levels are tied to things like insulin resistance. Elevated cortisol levels are tied to weight gain or fat deposition, and elevated insulin levels. We see that anything that has to do with high cortisol will be the same sort of effects that you would see with disjointed, if we want to call it that, sleep. So long list of stuff that can go wrong, but those are two of the main ones, or two or three of the main ones. How do you counteract it? Number one, don't do it. But if you have to, know that your body has to recover from it. So the body's going to need probably just a little bit extra sleep. Frankly, it's going to need a little bit more nutrients to handle that. And by nutrients, I mean all nutrients, like a lot of different micronutrients. It doesn't mean more pizza and cheeseburgers. Your body goes through and spills some of your reservoirs and those micronutrients. So a wide variety of micronutrients is probably useful for that time. And then also things that actually do affect the kind of the calm body. So if you do meditation, do it a little bit more. If you do yoga, do it a little bit more. If you regularly exercise very intensely, back off on that a little bit, because that's going to spill more nutrients and slow recovery. So those little bits and pieces I think are useful for the active person.
Yeah, fascinating. Do you personally travel much? Different time zones?
All the time. Yeah. I think last year I put on like 130,000 miles in the air. So I'm up and down, all domestic U.S. stuff. Occasionally I have to go to Germany, but anyway, so yeah, I fly a ton, but we only have 3 time zones. So the time zone issue isn't as big of a deal. My major stressor when traveling, and I think this is common, is dehydration. Going up in planes and then just being in the stagnant air and the recirculated air. Those are all really significantly problematic. One of the things I found to be super useful is a dry salt inhaler. I don't know if you all have this, but a dry salt inhaler with Himalayan crystal salt, and you breathe that in, it can be really useful. It's like a day at the beach. I carry that with me when I go through, when I travel a lot. I usually lose it about every 3rd or 4th trip due to security, because they think it's some sort of weird thing, but it's usually like a ceramic looking jar with this like a mouthpiece on it. And you use that for 10, 15 minutes once or twice a day. And it seems to be really useful to ward off some of the infectious and gross agents from the recirculation. And then I'm just super bad about it, but I need to stay diligent about my water consumption when I'm traveling. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Does sprinkling the Celtic sea salt into water, for example, and drinking that through the day have a similar effect to the inhaler?
No, not quite the same effect, because there's no particulation that goes to the lungs themselves. So the dry salt inhaler literally does have, microscopic particulates that do get into the lungs. But what you're describing is something called Soleil therapy or brine therapy. There's a website that I can send you that has like a recipe on how to make Soleil. And that's really useful, I think, too.
Awesome. So you mentioned that obviously the time traveling or disjointed sleep, it increases cortisol levels, big stress impact on the body. Is that very similar to obviously the nutritional stress that can be put on the body as well? So I guess my question is, with unresourceful nutrition habits, how does that affect your sleep? And is it very similar to the disjointed sleep pattern?
Yeah, so large, high-fat meals at night are known to disrupt sleep. Over and over again, high-fat meals at night. So it's really hard for somebody who's a ketogenic eater and they're eating all fat all the time. They actually have to restrict their window of eating so that they don't have late meals prior to bed. So that's one thing to consider, is just evening meals. And sometimes when you're eating for business, for work, socially, that seems to be a problem. And alcohol actually tends to be bad too. So a rich meal at night with wine or whatever tends to be like the worst thing for you. And if you take that same meal and you pick it up and you move it to earlier in the day, the gallbladder functions better earlier in the day, the liver would function better at that time, and you can process those things a lot easier than you would. Now, that's not the way we live, and that's not the social environment, but just as a thing to be thinking about.
Absolutely. So if you're on a keto diet, would you just have a protein-based meal instead, or are you suggesting that we add some type of carbohydrates in there?
No, I mean, to remain in ketosis, you probably do have to still restrict the carbohydrates. So I just drop off and say, maybe you should stop eating like at the 5 or 6 o'clock hour. If you're trying to go to bed by 10, allow there to be a good 5 or 6 hours of fasting prior to bed, and that's probably the most useful for you.
Okay. Yeah. And for optimal health levels and I guess weight loss is sort of linked in with that. How many hours before bed would you actually eat? Do you have a recommendation around, is it bad to eat and then go straight to bed, or do you suggest 3-4 hours prior?
Yeah, so I'm gonna I'm gonna make general statements, because there's always people that do a little bit better. We have what's called the dawn effect, or the dawn phenomenon, where blood sugar tends to rise, or insulin rises early morning, and sometimes really early morning. And sometimes if you have a pronounced dawn effect, you might have to eat or do something different at night. But wiping away the weird circumstances, and I'm gonna lean on evidence because it's so much easier to do that. There's a new study, it was published last year, called the Adventist 2 study, that showed that individuals who did best with weight loss, regardless of sort of what their best constitutional meal plan was, they ate breakfast, and it was a pretty substantial breakfast. They fasted for 5 to 6 hours, so you didn't eat a morning snack. You ate a pretty significant, actually a very significant lunch, and then you fasted for 18 to 19 hours. So you basically never ate supper, and you'd eat big breakfast, a big lunch, fast, and that was key to losing weight. Versus another study that was published last year that showed young men athletes who would do the opposite. They would eat lunch and they would eat dinner, but then they'd skip breakfast. They're eating the same amount of calories. They're just skipping a different type of meal, and they had neurohormone dysregulation. So they dropped their testosterone levels, DHEA, androstenedione, several different factors decreased in these young, athletes. So I think my mainstay is don't skip breakfast.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with that.
And then if you have to eat dinner, it should be lighter. It should be lower caloric density, lower fat, unless you're keto, then just eat earlier.
Yeah, great advice. So with carbohydrates, and of course, if we're aiming for health and weight loss, is there a prime time to be eating carbohydrates, and a time that we, I guess, should just stay the hell away from them?
Yeah, actually, and this is sort of, maybe we learned this from bodybuilders in the 1970s. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Columbo when they were not making gains, they'd kind of mix up their routine and go eat pies at night, which led us to believe that if you're going to have carbohydrates in your diet, you could probably tolerate them best in the evening. And we know that evening carbohydrates tend to improve sleep. They do. It's a great way of helping to both induce sleep and to maintain deeper sleep. So if you're going to have carbohydrates, do that. So I work with some cancer patients, and we don't always do a full ketogenic diet. If they have a glioblastoma, we might, but oftentimes we modify a ketogenic diet enough so that we will have maybe like a 50-gram meal of carbohydrates, sort of a big bolus of carbohydrates, and that's always in the evening. And they modify it in a few different ways, but that's an example of when to go down that path.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there specific carbohydrates that you would recommend to have at night time? Obviously,
Yeah.
we'll stay away from high sugar foods, but yeah.
I do. Root vegetables. Root vegetables are awesome. So think about, parsnips are a little bit high in sugar, but things like beets and potatoes and sweet potatoes seem to be pretty good and tolerated by most people. And then you kind of shift from the root vegetables. Probably next on that list is things like jasmine rice, and then the list gets a little bit muddied and a lot uglier after that when it gets into other rices, and then it gets into breads, and then it gets into pastas, and now suddenly we're not even eating food. It's just sugar in a cool looking shape.
Yeah, very true, very true. Mate, I want to ask you one final main question before we wrap it up today. And I love asking this question. If I could put you in a time machine and send you back to when you were younger, send you back to the age of 17 or 18, what advice would you give yourself to I guess, help you improve your health and your life in general up until now?
I know exactly the answer to this question, and it's so goofy, and I'm embarrassed to share it. But I think I was 16 years old, and I was in the like the men's locker room reading a magazine, waiting for like the game to start or something. I was really focused in on it. It was basketball season, and I flipped open. It was probably like Sports Illustrated or Men's Health, or I don't know. And it was an Asics sneaker advertisement in that magazine. And it said this, sometimes you need to tell your body that you're in charge, or your body's not in charge, or something to that effect. And basically like it gave you permission to take a day off from running and exercise. And that messed with my mind so bad for so many years. I wish I would go back to the day before and I would rip that magazine up or take that ad out, because it's so easy to be like, well, I got to give myself a day off. I should just skip this workout. No, don't do that. Staying physically active gets so much harder as people get older. And I think getting a good mindset and sort of needing it and wanting to be active and developing that is so critical. And I have to work at it. I really have to work at it. I blame Asics sneaker company.
I love it, and great advice. And I think everyone needs to work at it, don't they? A lot of people starting off, they think that, they might look at, you or me or others and think, these people it's natural for them. But really, I think for everyone, we have to work at it every single day. We face the same mental and emotional barriers as everyone else. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And old or young. I mean, we worked in hospitals and long-term care units and nursing, and we would have these older people, like geriatric older people, and like they have to work out. They have to work out. And so they're sitting in their wheelchairs and, they're lifting their knees up, and they do it until they sweat. And that's, they keep their brains healthy. They keep their bodies healthier. Everybody needs to work out. Physical activity is, without question, probably next on my list, next to sleep.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Dr. Schuler, you are the man. I'm a huge fan of what you do. I truly am. And I think that, again, what you're doing is incredible. You're making a huge impact. And that's what I really love about what you're doing. Where can our listeners and community find out more about you and study up on what you do?
Sure. I like to post my whereabouts and what I'm doing on Facebook. You can just look me up. It's Dr. Corey Schuler on Facebook, but you can reach my clinic too at metabolictreatmentcenter.com. We don't post articles and stuff anymore, but we definitely kind of describe what we do, and our strategy is to help people with that. And that's it. Otherwise, you can catch me on LinkedIn. Professionals Unite, I guess. LinkedIn's a good place for me too. Just search my name, Corey Schuler.
Amazing, amazing. Dr. Corey Schuler, thank you so much for the interview today. Again, you're an inspiration. Keep fighting the good fight, and I hope we get to speak to you soon.
That'd be awesome. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.